All right, last time we saw that countries can basically win with free trade, that countries can have more of everything if they specialize based on comparative advantage and then trade with other countries. That said, there are a number of people who think that free trade is a problem and that we might need to limit or restrict free trade. So in this screencast, we're going to talk about what are called trade barriers, restrictions to trade. And in this screencast, I'm going to lay out what the arguments for trade barriers are, what the different kinds of trade barriers are, and then finally we'll look at graphically what trade barriers do to various markets. So first I'm going to lay out the arguments for trade barriers, and I'm going to leave it to you to think about or consider whether you find these arguments to be valid. Maybe they're valid for certain countries under certain conditions, or not. The first argument is called the national defense argument, which essentially says, look, maybe we don't want totally free trade because we want to ensure that we have domestic industries for things, especially things that are important if we were to ever go to war. Things like tanks, planes, food, that kind of stuff. The argument essentially goes, look, we never know who we're going to be at war with next. We can be at war with Canada tomorrow. So we don't want all tank production to happen in Canada. If we go to war with them, we'll have no tanks. So we might want to restrict free trade or prevent foreign competition to make sure we have domestic industries in the case we need them in times of war. The next argument, typically put forth by less developed countries, is called the infant industry argument, which says essentially this: look, we'll expose our domestic industries to the competition that foreign competitors pose, but only once those industries have grown up. While they're infants, while they're small and vulnerable, we need to protect them. So if we're just starting out, for example, with a solar panel industry in the United States, we're not going to subject that to foreign competition because we want it to grow up and be strong. And then once it's strong, we'll let other competitors compete against our domestic industries, but we need to give them time to grow up. That's called the infant industry argument. The third argument is called the dumping argument, which essentially goes like this. Look, if there are other countries out there that are doing things that are not market-based. In other words, for example, sometimes China, for example, is accused of selling products here that are actually below cost. That's called dumping. And what China's trying to do is basically drive all of our competition out of business by producing below cost goods. And then once our companies are out of business because they can't compete, then China would start jacking up prices. This is something that Walmart's sometimes accused of doing on a local basis. So if countries are doing that, we might want to stop them from doing that by putting up some kind of trade barrier. Fourth argument, the preservation of domestic jobs. We want to stop free trade because we don't want other competitors to steal American jobs. We don't want jobs going overseas. So if we find that we're losing our entire manufacturing base, for example, because it's going off to Asia, let's stop those Asian goods from coming in as a way to protect American jobs. The fifth argument is kind of a vague argument, the maintenance of a diverse and stable economy. This argument basically goes like this. Look, we never know what the next big new product's going to be. Maybe it's nanotechnology, solar panels, whatever. And so we want to protect our domestic industries because we don't want to expose them to too much foreign competition because we want those companies to be around for the next big new product. Finally, prevention of exploitation. Liberals especially tend to say things like, well, you know, we don't want free trade because look at what these other countries are doing to their workers. They're earning 25 cents an hour, they're in these sweatshops, they live under terrible conditions. And so to stop that from happening, we should stop trade, we should stop these sweatshops by simply not trading with these countries. Again, I'll leave it to you to think about whether a person who has a 25-cent an hour job is better off than having no job. But these are the arguments that are laid out typically for trade barriers. All right, so let's say we buy into one of these arguments and we decide to erect some kind of trade barrier. Let's talk about what kinds are available. The first kind, maybe the most common kind, are called tariffs. A tariff is a tax on foreign imports, essentially a way to make foreign competition more expensive than domestic industries. What it does graphically, and we'll see this in a bit, is reduce the supply of the product, shift the supply of the product to the left, which typically has the result of raising prices and reducing quantity for domestic consumers. Now, what else do I need to know? Tariffs help domestic producers, typically less efficient domestic producers, at the expense of domestic consumers and more efficient foreign producers. Tariffs have this one nice benefit, though, which is that they raise money for the government. They're a tax. And that money can be used things that domestic consumers might like. It could be used on things that domestic consumers might like. We could use that tax money to build roads or schools or whatever. So that's the one nice little benefit of a tariff. The second type of trade barrier is called a quota. A quota is a numerical limit on foreign imports. We might say to Japan, for example, you can ship in 1,000 cars or 1,000,000 cars. Now, graphically, it's going to look very similar, in fact, the same as a tariff. It's going to reduce the supply of the product, raising prices and reducing quantities. Again, quotas are going to wind up helping domestic producers at the expense of domestic consumers and typically more efficient foreign producers. The big difference between a tariff and a quota is that they don't raise money like tariffs do. And so from an economic perspective, if we're going to have one of the two, economists tend to like tariffs versus quotas. Finally, sometimes other countries will voluntarily agree to these quotas, and when they do, it's given a different name, a voluntary export restraint, which is another way of saying a quota that another country agrees to. The third type of trade barrier are regulations. Now, typically these are laws enacted by a government that makes it more difficult for foreign producers. Although typically these are kind of hidden costs. These are laws that governments pass that make it harder for foreign producers, even if it doesn't seem like that's the point of the law. Now, what they do depends on what the law is, but usually, again, they're going to wind up restricting the supply of a product, again, raising prices for consumers. So examples of that include onerous licensing requirements, unreasonable standards, bureaucratic red tape, rules that foreign producers are subject to that domestic producers might not be. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, Congress passed a law that the president signed stopping Mexican truckers from delivering products in the United States. And the law was ostensibly about safety. The idea was that Mexican truckers weren't as safe as American truckers, that their trucks weren't as safe, and so for safety reasons, we were going to stop these Mexican truckers. In actuality, it was really about protecting American jobs in the American trucking industry. And Harvard actually did a study a year or two later and found that Mexican truckers were on average safer than US truckers. So it wasn't really about safety, it was about restricting foreign competition to help out American producers and American workers. Finally, the last kind of trade barrier are subsidies. Subsidies are payments to domestic producers from governments to give them an advantage versus foreign producers. Now, these have an opposite effect graphically. They tend to shift the supply curve to the right. They make it easier for domestic producers to produce. Now, subsidies are effectively a wealth transfer from taxpayers to domestic producers. We say to domestic producers, for every car you produce, for every solar panel you produce, we'll give you a payment. Now that skews free trade because we're giving our domestic producers an unfair advantage compared to foreign producers. We're making it easier for them kind of artificially. And in fact, with stuff like farm products, the United States heavily subsidizes our producers. And if you go to Africa and ask African leaders, for example, what we could do to help out their economies, they don't say things like give us more money or more free international aid. What they say is stop your domestic subsidies for farm products because they're making it impossible for our farmers to compete against you worldwide. This is why we're constantly having famines. We don't have a domestic farm industry because the United States and Europe actually subsidize their farmers. All right, now that said, the trend since World War II has been the reduction of trade barriers because people pretty much understand comparative advantage now. So what's happened since World War II are the creation of what are known as free trade zones, which are essentially agreements between countries to reduce or eliminate trade barriers. Some examples that you might be familiar with: NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, where Mexico, Canada, and the United States have agreed to reduce trade barriers between them. The European Union is essentially one large free trade zone, where the countries there have agreed not to erect trade barriers between them. And then worldwide, we have something called the World Trade Organization, which over 180 countries belong to, where again, the agreement is that they will reduce trade barriers over time between them. All right, let's take a look at what trade barriers do graphically. Let's start out with a typical supply and demand graph. This might be the supply and demand of anything. We could say apples. And let's first assume no free trade. So the supply curve represents domestic producers only. The demand curve represents domestic consumers. We know we're going to go to equilibrium here, which is pretty simple. Equilibrium's happening right here. And we're going to get a certain equilibrium price and a certain equilibrium quantity. We might call that the price, the domestic price, or the domestic quantity. If we have free trade, the supply curve is going to shift to the right. We're allowing all of those producers, those foreign producers, into the country to sell their goods. Notice what happens to the price and the quantity. The price goes down and the quantity goes up. So you can see why domestic consumers would like free trade. But what about domestic producers? If you follow that new price line across to where it hits the domestic supply curve, you'll notice that domestic producers are now producing less than they were before. And not only are they producing less, they're producing less at a lower price. You can see why domestic producers don't like free trade. Well, if domestic producers are producing quantity D1 at that free trade price, then the rest of the quantity is what foreign producers are producing. Those are the imports. So you can see at this price that in this graph, foreign producers are actually producing most of what's being produced in this market now. All right, now let's erect a trade barrier. A trade barrier would mean having free trade, but limiting it. So the supply curve is going to be somewhere between the two supply curves we've already seen. It's going to be more supply than just no trade, but less supply than if we had perfectly free trade. It would look like this. Now you can see why domestic consumers don't like trade barriers. Compared to free trade, the price goes up and the quantity goes down. But you could also see why domestic producers would like a trade barrier. Again, follow that new price to where it hits that domestic supply curve. Notice that the amount of domestic production is increased compared to free trade. Not only that, they're able to charge a higher price. So domestic consumers are hurt, but domestic producers are going to like that trade barrier. In terms of foreign producers, they don't like it. You'll notice that at that new price, since domestic producers are producing more, and since the total quantity's gone down, the amount of imports, the amount produced by foreign producers, is going to drop as well. All right, this is the graph that you're going to need to know for trade barriers, and that's pretty much what you need to know about trade barriers. Again, you'll see an assignment that deals with this graph. You might want to have this graph open, or the screencast open when you try it. I'll leave you with a little cartoon that kind of summarizes trade barriers, and I'll see you next time.
Ladies and gentlemen, the unthinkable has happened. Some sick, twisted individual has stolen every teacher's edition in this school.
What do we do? Declare a snow day!
Does anyone know the multiplication table?
Please, don't panic. They can smell fear.